I now want to talk about another specific Athabascan group, Gwich'in people. There's about 1,100 or so Gwich'in people here in Alaska, and then another 3,200 or so that live just across the border in Canada, which is a good illustration of a fact that I like to bring up in my courses sometimes, which is that settler borders don't necessarily match indigenous borders, and in fact very often cross-cut them. Just as the O'odham group on the Mexico-U.S. border is currently essentially having a border wall constructed between traditional O'odham lands, because the U.S.-Mexico border goes directly through traditional O'odham lands. In a somewhat similar, although perhaps less heated, example, here up in Alaska, Gwich'in lands are bisected by the U.S.-Canada border, and there's Gwich'in cooperation that happens between the two nations. So, for example, you have the Gwich'in steering community, which involves leaders from the communities on both sides of the border, but technically speaking, Gwich'in traditional lands are sort of cut in half. Caribou people, what do I mean by that? We're going to focus in on a very specific aspect of Gwich'in culture today, which is certainly not the only aspect, but a very important aspect, which is relationship to caribou. Now, to tell that story, let's tell another story, though, to kind of connect a traditional culture issue with a very contemporary, modern political issue, which is Alaska, which is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is an issue I remember hearing about for decades, right? This has been going on for decades before I lived in Alaska, and of course I have a more, I guess, immediate connection to in some regards now. And the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, of course, as most of us living in Alaska are probably aware, is a wilderness, or rather, I should say, a wildlife refuge, a federal public land found all the way up there, very far northern Alaska, close to Prudhoe Bay. And there's a significant amount of petroleum reserves within ANWR, and there's been debate for many, many decades over whether or not drilling should occur within a national wildlife refuge, which of course, being public land and national wildlife refuge, it's not owned per se by well, it's complicated, and we'll talk about why it's complicated. But anytime we're talking about public lands, the politics of whether or not oil drilling should occur is one that becomes very complicated because there's a lot of different interest groups and a lot of different groups, period, that are interested in what happens to public lands. One of the things that makes this issue particularly complicated is that there's caribou migration that goes right through this relatively small portion of it called the 1002 area. So in the 1002 area or 1002 area, there's this migrating herd of caribou called the porcupine herd, a very, very large herd of caribou. And they migrate over this large territory of land that extends far outside of ANWR and goes all the way to Gwich'in territory. And traditionally, Gwich'in have hunted from this caribou herd extensively. And yet that caribou herd, that's during the fall and winter that it's over in Gwich'in territory during this right at kind of spring time where you're raising your calves and having your calves. They're up here right where the oil fields would be. So there's concern, as you might imagine, by people that hunt the caribous down here that oil activity up here might affect where the caribou during a time period where, in a sense, they're especially vulnerable, right? Where the mothers are trying to sort of have and raise their calves. And so that's a concern. And as you read about, I kind of tried to do two readings that would present, if not opposing sides, at least kind of some nuance to the issue, because there has been, different scientists that have come to different kinds of conclusions about the effect that oil exploration would have on the caribou herd. It's partly hard to determine that since the oil exploration right now is still hypothetical, right? We're not exactly sure what it would look like. We do know that to some degree caribou do modify their behavior and in fact give a very wide berth or avoidance to oil operations and roads and things of this nature. They don't particularly like to be particularly close to these kind of operations, which makes sense if you've dealt much with caribou, right? They're not exactly, well, they may actually sometimes end up in your backyard if you live in Alaska, but generally speaking, they're not backyard animals. They're going to want to kind of give a wide berth, especially a big herd like that, by which I mean give a wide distance. And so there's concerns that this would really disrupt their pattern because they have kind of a slim area of land that traditionally they raise their babies in. And there's concern that this would affect that behavior and that would affect the survival and well-being of the herd, which is, of course, of concern to folks that hunt the caribou. So this is a complex issue then. It's also a long-standing issue, so it's not some new thing, although it's been in the news recently. Instead, it's been going on in one form or another for several decades. In a sense, we can write you don't have to memorize all these dates, but you can have this slide available for the test, but just to kind of listen to my voice rather than trying to memorize all this. I know it's a really text-heavy slide, and I apologize. basically, we can kind of trace the history going back all the way to the 60s. During the Eisenhower administration, it wasn't called ANWR at the time, but a wildlife refuge was established in the area that we now call Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. In 1971, ANCSA was passed, which gave, among other things, you had the Inupiat village of Kaktovik, which was given subsurface rights, or given is sort of the wrong word, reserved subsurface rights to about 69,000 acres within the refuge. So they have oil rights to a small portion of the refuge. In 1983, by the way, those oil rights passed to ASRC, which is Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, which is basically the very large regional corporation that oversees much of the North Slope and is predominantly Inupiat shareholders. In 1980, ANWR got expanded under the Jimmy Carter administration and renamed to its current name, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And it was specifically said within sort of the act that established that, because by this time people were aware of the fact that there was big oil deposits under it, it was specifically left open. It basically said, although this is a huge wildlife refuge, it can be used for oil exploration if Congress specifically designates it so. Okay, that's going to solve the issue, right? Debate over? Just Congress makes the decision and that'll be simple? No, because that has initiated kind of a 20-year debate within Congress. In 1989, the Bush Senior administration recommended that Congress open the land to oil development. In 1995, eventually Congress did pass this, that they were going to open ANWR to oil. And when I say Congress, I mean both houses, Senate and House of Representatives. But the Clinton administration actually blocked it. And I should say it was part of like a bigger law, a budget law, which is typically how people have tried to pass ANWR oil drilling. It, like a lot of things, it wasn't sort of its own thing, but it was instead wrapped into other laws. So it becomes complicated sometimes to say, like, is that what exactly was going on when people were supporting or rejecting it? Because it was built into other bigger bills. But anyways, under the Clinton administration, it was blocked. So we kind of see this back and forth going on between the executive branch and the Congress, particularly depending on which president is in power. Around this time, they estimate that there's 20 billion barrels of oil underneath ANWR. That doesn't mean all 20 billion would be or able to be extracted, but 20 billion barrels, which is a lot. 2002 to 2005 is a time period where, after kind of a lull, Congress tries to pass it several more times. However, in the Senate, they're never able to block the filibustering being done by Democratic politicians primarily. And so even with the pushing of, Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, it doesn't happen. So kind of we have another sort of lull period in a sense. And then in 2015, it's kind of this long standing where there will be a lull and then it flares up again, kind of shows how economically valuable the resource is, at least to some people in some communities, and therefore it keeps sort of being brought to the table. So in 2015, there's, still talks of trying to do the oil drilling there. Throughout this whole 2005 to 2015, the Obama administration seeks to designate significant portions of ANWR as wilderness areas, which if you don't know this about U.S. public land law, a wilderness area is sort of the most protected designation you can give to a piece of public land. And so that would have effectively barred, or at least made much more difficult oil development. So that was eventually, though, struck down when in 2017, so basically Congress said, no, we're not going to allow you to make that a wilderness area because they have to be involved in something like that. And then in 2017, both Congress and the Trump administration, now that Republicans had significantly more power, approved ANWR for development. And at this point, it's still sort of in the planning process as I understand it. But that's a really long timeline if you think about it. And it kind of shows the potency and the amount of money involved, right? If this was some sort of small potatoes amount of money for this oil resource, probably would have been handled, 20 years ago. But because it is such an economically valuable resource, but also such a charged resource in a lot of other ways, it's been a really long-standing issue within Alaska communities. And, there's not agreement within Alaska, as oftentimes Alaskans might disagree with each other on different issues. So during this same time period where some communities and some groups within Alaska have really been pushing for opening the refuge up to oil exploration, or at least I should say that portion of it, the 1002 section, at the same time, there's been significant opposition from a number of other Alaskan communities, especially the Gwich'in Steering Committee, which again represents Gwich'in people on both the U.S. and Canadian side of the border, so represents the about 4,000 people strong Gwich'in community, which is not a small number of people. And also many Gwich'in people, especially those living in Arctic Village, which is very much right there in the line of where the Caribou come through and where some of the prominent people that are opposing this have come from. It's also been opposed, of course, by environmental advocacy groups, both environmentalists here and elsewhere, for reasons of the impacts that it would conceivably have on caribou herds. So that makes it complex, right? You have a group of people, thousands of people, and certainly several hundred within the Gwich'in communities on this side of the border who feel like caribou hunting would be significantly altered, if not altogether ruined, by oil development. And it actually becomes a more complicated picture because not only are there large sort of oil companies that would like to extract the oil from there, but you also have a kind of complicated situation with there being some Alaska Native people on both sides of this issue. So you have the village of Kaktovik, which you read about, right? That Inupiat village. And that village has been able to be relatively prosperous from oil exploration in general from some of its oil producing lands. So Kaktovik has, for example, despite being right there in the far north where typically communities are very underserved, Kaktovik has things like a legit fire station, fire force, and fire truck. Kaktovik has things like running water toilets, so things that a lot of the other communities in the area lack. So Kaktovik has benefited pretty substantially from oil. It's a community of about 250 people, if I'm remembering correctly, Inupiat people primarily. And their point of view is that, or I should, whenever I say there for a group of 250, I should clarify some Kaktovik people. I certainly can't say for all Kaktovik people, but certainly some Inupiat people in this village feel like oil exploration would be a really good thing for them, because for them, that's much closer to them and something they would conceivably benefit from. I'm not sure if that's because their oil rights extend into the 1002 area. I think that's what's going on. And then also just employment, right? And so for them, sort of, this is a way of economically moving forward and providing for our village and things like that. So you have Native people on both sides. And as the Don Young quote, Representative Don Young quote, kind of was laying out some of those complexities, right? In the sense that these Native communities don't necessarily live the same degree of distance from the oil. So Kaktovik is really, really close to where the oil would be extracted, whereas Arctic Village, Yupik area, is about 100 miles from it, and as people will point out, kind of a mountain range between it. Now, of course, for us Alaskans, we would say, well, mountain range and 100 miles isn't a whole lot for Alaskans. But the argument there is sort of, well, if the Native community that's close to it wants to drill oil and this other Native community that's further, shouldn't we be listening to this one? That's what Don Young was arguing in that article. And so that's a complicated subject, right? And it's partly complicated because of one of these things about land issues and hunting issues and fishing issues and environmental issues, which is that those darn fish and animals and air and water don't stay put where they're supposed to, right? The caribou don't stay in this oil exploration area. They migrate over a huge territory. The porcupine herd, whoa, huge migration path. And so something that affects here doesn't really just affect here, it also affects people that are using the same resource down here. So indigenous politics are never simple. They're particularly not simple in this case. What do you make the decision based on? Who's using the caribou, who's using the oil, which community is closer, which community is larger, all sorts of complicated questions. But whatever decision, however you come down on this issue, or whether you decide you don't have an opinion at all on it, which is totally your right, either way, I think good decisions requires good information. So today we're going to talk a lot about sort of Inupiat concerns and what that's rooted in. Gwich'in concerns. And I don't want to, in that, sort of be downplaying Inupiat support for the project, but kind of just, since I am focusing today on Gwich'in and Athabascan people, kind of zeroing in on where some of the concerns come about with the ANWR oil exploration.